Welcome back. Today we bring you an in-depth report on one of the most significant maritime incidents in recent years, a confrontation that has stirred outrage, diplomatic tension, and a renewed global debate over the legality of blockades and the rights of civilians in war zones. The story begins on the night of October 2nd, moving into the early hours of October 3rd, when Israeli naval forces intercepted nearly every vessel of the Global Sumud Flotilla, a civilian aid mission that had set out with a declared intention of delivering food, medicine, and humanitarian supplies to Gaza. What happened on those waters has since cascaded into demonstrations, diplomatic complaints, and rising calls for accountability. The flotilla itself was not a small symbolic effort, but rather a coordinated movement of over 40 civilian vessels carrying more than 450 international activists, aid workers, parliamentarians, lawyers, climate advocates, doctors, and volunteers. They came from a wide range of countries across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Their mission was framed as both humanitarian and political, to break the long-standing naval blockade of Gaza and to shine a spotlight on what they describe as the human suffering of civilians caught under siege. These boats had departed from ports around the Mediterranean, including Barcelona, Genoa, Sicily, and Tunis. Each port added ships, volunteers, and supplies, creating a fleet that many supporters called the largest civilian maritime effort for Gaza in decades. Organizers named their initiative the Global Sumud Flotilla, borrowing the Arabic word sumud, which translates roughly to steadfastness or perseverance. To them, the journey was not only about the delivery of material aid, but about demonstrating the will of civil society to stand against restrictions they consider unjust. Activists aboard the ships carried medicine, food, and symbolic items like children's books and art materials, which they said represented hope and human dignity in the face of deprivation. They streamed their voyage live on social media, broadcasting their progress, their songs, their speeches, and their message of solidarity with Gaza's people. Yet the Israeli government had made its position clear well in advance. Officials repeatedly stated that no vessel would be permitted to enter Gaza by sea. Israel regards Gaza as an active war zone and enforces a naval blockade that has been in place since 2007 after Hamas took control of the territory. Israeli authorities argue that the blockade is necessary to prevent the smuggling of weapons and military equipment to Hamas and other armed groups. They insist that humanitarian aid can and must be delivered through land crossings and supervised channels, which they say guarantee both the safety of aid workers and Israel's security. In their view, any attempt to bypass this system amounts to a provocation and an unnecessary risk. In the early hours of October 2nd, Israeli naval forces moved to intercept the flotilla in international waters. Reports indicate that the Navy boarded more than a dozen vessels in a coordinated series of operations. Activists Live streamed the arrival of Israeli warships and commandos. The footage showed heavily armed soldiers in helmets and tactical gear approaching on fast boats, climbing aboard the aid vessels, and ordering passengers to sit down and remain calm. Passengers were seen huddled in life vests, many raising their hands, some chanting slogans but none armed. In several instances, communications were cut as soon as boarding occurred, leaving gaps in the live streams and fueling speculation about the force used during those moments. By dawn, Israeli officials confirmed they had taken control of most of the flotilla, redirecting ships and passengers to the port of Ashdod. Activists reported being detained, searched, and stripped of phones and cameras. Many were transported by bus to detention facilities, where processing for deportation began. Among those detained were prominent public figures, including lawmakers from European parliaments and well-known climate activists. The flotilla's largest backers included humanitarian groups, trade unions, and civil society organizations that had pledged to support participants legally and diplomatically. Still, one boat remained at sea. The vessel named Marinette pressed on even after its companions had been stopped. For a few hours, it seemed possible that it might evade interception and reach Gaza's territorial waters. But on October 3rd, in the early morning, Israeli naval forces again launched an operation, this time boarding and seizing the Marinette around 42 nautical miles off the coast of Gaza. That final boarding marked the end of the flotilla's journey. In total, more than 40 vessels had been prevented from reaching Gaza, and over 450 people had been detained. Israel later announced that several detainees, including 4 Italian activists, had already been deported and that the rest would follow. The deportation process is ongoing, with governments across Europe, Africa, and Latin America pressing for the release of their citizens. The flotilla participants denounced the action as unlawful, arguing that they were engaged in a peaceful humanitarian mission. Israeli officials countered that the flotilla was a staged provocation designed to undermine their security measures and provide cover for Hamas. The reactions were immediate and global. In European cities such as Rome, Paris, Barcelona, and Geneva, thousands took to the streets. Protesters gathered outside Israeli embassies and consulates, chanting slogans like "Free Gaza" and holding placards calling for an end to the blockade. Labor unions in Italy called for a strike, and demonstrations spread to Spain, South Africa, Turkey, Pakistan, and beyond. In Istanbul, large crowds assembled outside the United States consulate, condemning both Israel and what they called Western complicity in maintaining the blockade. In Berlin, solidarity demonstrations erupted, and in some cases protesters occupied railways. In many of these protests, activists displayed flags, banners, and photographs of flotilla participants, framing them as heroes unjustly detained. Governments too reacted strongly. Spain, South Africa, Turkey, and several Latin American states summoned Israeli diplomats to lodge protests. Officials in Pakistan condemned the interceptions and called on international organizations to intervene. Leaders across the Arab world repeated long-standing demands that the blockade of Gaza be lifted. Israel's closest allies expressed concern, but largely refrained from outright condemnation, reiterating Israel's right to defend its security while urging restraint and the safe treatment of detainees. Human rights organizations quickly weighed in. They argued that under international humanitarian law, civilian relief missions should be granted safe passage unless they pose a direct military threat. Critics say that blocking the flotilla constitutes collective punishment of Gaza's population, already facing severe shortages of food, water, electricity, and medical supplies. The blockade, they contend, violates the principle that warring parties must distinguish between combatants and civilians. Legal scholars noted that while naval blockades are recognized under the law of armed conflict, they must comply with strict criteria. They must be declared. They must not starve the civilian population, and they must permit the delivery of essential humanitarian aid. The Israeli operation, they argued, fails this test. Israel maintains the opposite view. Officials insist the flotilla was a political stunt and that humanitarian supplies can be delivered through established routes. They argue that allowing civilian ships to approach Gaza without inspection could create a dangerous precedent, enabling the smuggling of arms under the cover of aid. The Israeli military stressed that its boarding operations were carried out professionally, proportionally, and with minimal force, and that no serious injuries occurred. They dismissed comparisons to the infamous 2010 Mavi Marmara raid, when Israeli commandos stormed a Turkish ship in a Gaza flotilla and killed 9 activists, sparking international condemnation and a deep rupture in Israel-Turkey relations. In this case, Israel emphasized that no casualties had occurred, framing the operation as successful and restrained. The flotilla episode cannot be understood in isolation. Gaza has been under blockade since 2007. Following the rise of Hamas, the blockade covers land, air, and sea, with Israel tightly controlling what enters and exits. Over the years, this blockade has been condemned by the United Nations, human rights bodies, and many governments as a form of collective punishment. Gaza's population, more than 2 million people, faces chronic shortages of food, medicine, clean water, and electricity. Unemployment is among the highest in the world, and infrastructure is devastated by repeated wars. Israel argues that Hamas uses materials like cement and metal for military purposes and that security concerns justify restrictions. Yet for Palestinians and their supporters, the blockade is a suffocating policy that denies basic human rights and exacerbates an already dire humanitarian situation. The Global Sumud Flotilla is only the latest in a series of such attempts to break the blockade. Civilian flotillas have set sail at various times over the last decade, often organized by international coalitions of activists and NGOs. Some have been intercepted quietly, others violently. The memory of the 2010 raid remains especially vivid, a reminder of how quickly these confrontations can escalate. This year's flotilla, however, was far larger and more organized than most previous efforts, which explains why Israel responded with such a heavy and coordinated operation. For those aboard the flotilla, the mission was about more than delivering aid. It was about challenging the world to see the blockade for what they believe it is, an unjust stranglehold on a civilian population. They invoked international law, the principles of human dignity, and the obligation of the global community to act. They carried flags and banners with words like freedom, justice, and humanity. They brought doctors, lawyers, parliamentarians, and activists who could not easily be dismissed as extremists. For them, the flotilla was a floating protest, a living statement that ordinary people from many nations would not remain silent. For Israel, however, the flotilla was a challenge to its sovereignty and its security. The government framed it as a deliberate provocation timed to coincide with Jewish holidays and designed to embarrass the state on the global stage. Israeli leaders argued that their citizens still live under the threat of rockets and attacks from Gaza, and that weakening the blockade would endanger lives. They presented the interception not as a choice, but as a necessity, a defense of national security in the face of what they describe as hostile actors seeking to exploit humanitarian pretexts. The international legal debate is now heating up. Some experts argue that by intercepting civilian vessels in international waters, Israel overstepped its rights. Others note that under certain interpretations of the law of naval warfare, a blockade can be enforced in international waters provided it has been declared and is recognized as part of an armed conflict. The key question becomes whether such a blockade is lawful if it leads to starvation, deprivation, or the denial of humanitarian assistance. Critics of Israel argue that the blockade fails on those grounds, while Israel insists it allows aid through land routes, and that the flotilla's defiance of procedure disqualifies it from protection. Beyond law and politics, the human dimension remains the most pressing. In Gaza, hospitals continue to struggle with shortages of medicine and equipment. Families face hunger, with many relying on international aid organizations to survive. Power cuts leave homes and schools without electricity for much of the day. Clean water is scarce. For ordinary Palestinians, the interception of the flotilla represents yet another blocked lifeline, another reminder of isolation. For activists around the world, the images of civilians detained at sea evoke anger and despair, but also renewed determination to press the issue onto the global agenda. Media coverage has amplified the sense of drama. Live footage of naval forces approaching small aid boats, activists chanting as soldiers boarded, and crowds protesting outside embassies make for powerful visuals. Such imagery resonates strongly with audiences on social media and news channels, fueling hashtags, debates, and viral clips. The narrative of small civilian boats confronting one of the region's most powerful militaries carries symbolic weight, reminding many of past struggles for freedom and civil rights. The broader diplomatic implications remain uncertain. Will countries escalate pressure on Israel through sanctions investigations or resolutions in international forums? Will they pursue legal cases on behalf of their detained citizens? Will Israel face isolation, or will its allies shield it diplomatically? The answers are not yet clear, but the flotilla has already injected fresh urgency into discussions that had faded into stalemate. It has reminded the world that Gaza's plight remains unresolved, and that civil society is willing to challenge state power on the high seas. Some organizers have already announced their intention to launch future flotillas, declaring that this interception will not end their campaign. They vow to return with more boats, more participants, and even greater determination. Israel has responded by promising that any such attempts will again be blocked. The confrontation seems destined to repeat, a cycle of defiance and enforcement that underscores the deadlock at the heart of the Gaza crisis. For now, the intercepted activists are being deported, the flotilla's supplies remain in Israeli custody, and Gaza continues under blockade. But the story does not end there. The images of detainees, the chants of protesters, the condemnations of governments, and the appeals of human rights groups ensure that the flotilla will remain a topic of debate for weeks and months to come. It is a reminder that in today's interconnected world, acts of civil disobedience at sea can ripple across continents, inspiring solidarity, outrage, and renewed calls for justice. As the dust settles on this incident, the world is left with difficult questions. Is it lawful to stop a humanitarian convoy on the high seas? Does security justify sealing off a population of more than 2 million? What role should international law, human rights, and global solidarity play in conflicts that have persisted for decades? And most of all, who will bear the consequences of these unanswered questions? For the people of Gaza, the answer is already clear. This has been a long, complex story, one that blends law, politics, and humanity. We have traced the flotilla's journey from Mediterranean ports to the waters off Gaza, its interception by Israeli naval forces, the detention of hundreds of activists, the global wave of protests, the heated legal debate, and the humanitarian implications. We have seen how symbolism and strategy collide on the open sea and how civilian determination meets military enforcement. That concludes our deep report on the Global Sumud Flotilla and the events of October 2nd and 3rd. We will continue to follow developments, including the deportation of detainees, the diplomatic fallout, and the humanitarian impact on Gaza. Thank you for staying with us through this extended analysis, and thank you for listening. Stay tuned as we bring you more updates on the stories that shape our world.